This video is sponsored by Skillshare.
There are certain characters who are iconic villains and monsters. The Wicked Witch, the vampire, the boogeyman. But one scary figure in pop culture doesn't outwardly appear so terrifying at all. She's vengeful and ruthless, cold and cunning. She has the tactical prowess of a political mastermind and the calculating mind of a killer. And she does it all from behind a sweet, innocent facade. The teenage girl is at the heart of so many shows, and she's only getting scarier. So when did Hollywood turn her so terrifying, and what's driving the shift? In this 3-part series, we're going to take you on a trip into the history of the terrifying teen girl on screen.
Girls, watch out for those weirdos.
We are the weirdos, mister.
While many of our favorite iconic, scary teen girls began popping up on screen in the 80s and 90s, the seed for the trope was planted much earlier. According to gender studies professor Ilana Nash, the author of American Sweethearts, Teenage Girls in 20th Century Popular Culture, historically, teen girls on screen could be one of two things. Either they were angelic and sweet, almost absurdly well-behaved, or else they were agents of chaos, challenging the status quo. Whichever she was, Nash says the teenage girl unfailingly appears either more or less than human, never simply a whole person with her own three-dimensional subjectivity. Instead, she becomes a type, an iconic abstraction representing dominant culture's desires or nightmares. Nash also says that for decades, the teenage girl was imagined in pop culture as a non-person, usually simply a foil for adult men. Maybe this erasure of the teenager as she really was is in part because in the first half of the 20th century, teenagers as a group were starting to frighten adults. In the 1940s, for example, juvenile delinquency became a big preoccupation.
Juvenile delinquency now is recognized as a major problem by the top law enforcement officials of the land.
So it makes sense that on-screen teens would be used to preach morality in an attempt to counteract this. What also makes sense is that this fear of teenagers stems from adults' inability to understand them.
You don't know anything about the wonderful world of teenage girls. They're all crazy.
In lieu of picking apart individual teen characters' psychology, earlier writers and directors often simply cast teen girls to type in pretty one-dimensional stereotypical roles like the girl-next-door love interest, until they eventually realized that she might present fertile ground for creativity. While they usually continued to be slotted into pretty well-defined tropes, teen girl characters were allowed to be more multifaceted and to feel more like real people with their own thoughts and ideas. What's more, many of the teen girl characters who emerged in the 80s and 90s seemed to act as a way of the adults writing them working through what it means to be a teenager in that time. So as teen pregnancy, drug use, and self-destruction escalated in real life, they also appeared more regularly in the teen characters that emerged on screen.
One thing that scares people most about teen girls is their intelligence. And just like our favorite scary girl icons, I always love learning something new. And this autumn, I'm looking to make my whole life more productive by learning how to take my Notion skills to the next level through classes and learning paths on Skillshare. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creatives, with thousands of classes led by industry experts across film, illustration, design, freelance, productivity, and more. Skillshare can help you take your career, skills, hobbies, passions, or side hustles to the next level. And if you're not sure where to start, there are lots of awesome learning paths, which are groups of hand-picked classes that build on one another. So you can get started learning without stressing about which class you should take. Skillshare has also updated their class system with smarter class categories, the ability to find classes by software and material, and 3 new class topics covering creative careers, creative inspiration, and AI and innovation. So don't miss your chance to discover an awesome new skill this autumn. The first 500 people to use our link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today.
The disconnect between adults and teenagers forms the basis of many beloved 80s and 90s shows and films.
I'm 16 years old. I'm not a child
Don't
anymore.
you take that tone of voice with me, young lady.
And there's a subgenre of this trope where the teenage girl embodies the anxieties of the adults, coming to represent their loss of control over their children. For example, in the original 2 seasons of Twin Peaks, teen Laura Palmer's eerily beautiful body is found wrapped in a tarp, and the mystery of who killed her begins to unfold. While it has hallmarks of the morality tales of 1940s, 50s, and 60s stories about teenagers, Twin Peaks actually actually exposes a great parental fear that their children might secretly be doing things that would horrify them.
Fact, Laura had a sweet tooth for nose candy.
As Laura's secret life unfolds and we get closer to finding her killer, it becomes apparent that the town of Twin Peaks is teeming with lies. None of the parents know what their supposedly model student kids are doing, despite the fact that there are a concerning number of horrible crossovers between the parallel worlds of adults and teenagers.
Mrs. Palmer, there are things dark and heinous in this world. Things too horrible to tell our children.
And Laura's corpse is like a diary, so it's not enough that she's dead. Her body tells the story of where she was and what happened to her.
He's also determined the bites and marks on her shoulders were made by a parrot or a mynah bird.
This idea of the teen girl's body having secrets is something that's explored in everything from chick flicks to horror films, and in this instance may be linked to the genuine fear-mongering that was happening at the time the show was airing. During the 80s and 90s, teen pregnancy and drug use were on the rise, leading President Bill Clinton's government to attempt to intervene.
Teen pregnancy, because it is a moral problem and a personal problem and a challenge that individual young people should face, and because it has reached such proportions that it is a very significant economic and social problem for the United States.
So in Twin Peaks, Laura's body is a site of tension for everyone in the town who has no idea what their kids are getting up to after dark. An early example of the teen girl who takes charge with terrifying consequences is the 1976 adaptation of Stephen King's Carrie. Carrie as a character is belittled and bullied her entire high school experience, but her torturers don't know that she has the power of telekinesis. What makes the film so horrific is the other teenagers' treatment of Carrie throughout. It's no wonder she snaps at the end, sending most of the student body to their grisly deaths. And this is a pattern that repeats to this day in films about teenagers. Sometimes the scariest aspects aren't violent acts, but the psychological trauma inflicted by some teenagers on others. Just like Carrie, many movies and shows from the 80s, 90s, and beyond are set in high school. Scriptwriters inflate the tension of the place where teenagers spend most of their time to create a backdrop that buzzes with drama. And the teen characters themselves are terrifying because of what's going on inside them. Their raging hormones, their poor impulse control, their inability to think ahead to the consequences of their actions. In Heathers, for example, teenagers Veronica and JD murder their classmates and cover their tracks by making it look like the students took their own lives. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, at the time Heathers was released, teen suicide rates had been steadily rising since the 1950s and were about to peak. So when you put it into that context, what could be a more perfect setup for two budding serial killers than high school? In the 1980s, Teen Witch showed how much easier navigating high school would be for teenage girls if they had an edge over everyone else.
For Louise Miller, high school was a living hell.
Everything gets better for Louise when she turns 16 and receives magical powers. She can make the boy she likes fall in love with her, become the most popular girl in school, and help her friends along the way. Classic 90s show Sabrina the Teenage Witch, based on the 1960s comic of the same name, fleshed out this premise. It's centered on a family of quirky, immortal witches, Zelda and Hilda Spellman, who are both hundreds of years old, and their teenage niece, Sabrina. Sabrina quickly dispels all notions of wicked witches and evil magic and exposes high school as the true horror story, recasting the witch as the good guy and the popular cheerleader as the villain.
Libby's not popular, she's powerful.
Well, how did she get the power?
She seized it, and as long as there are people backing her up, she'll keep it. It's all very Stalin.
But when it came to teen witches on screen in the 80s and 90s, Sabrina and Louise were the tip of the iceberg. Journalist Kelsey Staller writes that the uptick in witches on screen in the 90s was directly linked to the fight for female autonomy. She says that when women's resistance is at a fever pitch, as it was in the 60s and the 90s, and women are seeking empowering stories that allow them to control their own narratives, stories about witchcraft seem to become more popularized. But the teenage witch was a particularly 90s phenomenon, perhaps because with all of the other anxieties that the teen girl elicits, communing with spirits and performing magic made her even more terrifying. There are some standout examples of teen witches from the 1990s. Perhaps most memorable of all is Nancy from The Craft. When the film begins, she's sinister, an outcast, and a bully rolled into one. But as it progresses, she becomes outright petrifying.
In the old days, if a witch betrayed her coven,
they would kill her.
And what makes her all the more compelling is that everything about her, from her makeup and costume choices to her open sexuality and sharp tongue, is quintessentially 90s. To audiences at the time, and audiences that continue to watch the movie today, Nancy is recognizable. She could be a girl at any school, which makes the movie all the more unsettling. This battle for autonomy also played out in more positive ways with girls who harnessed their sometimes terrifying powers to save themselves and even the world.
Need a hand?
No thanks. I'm good.
Buffy Summers had to navigate all of the pain and drama of high school while also constantly being under attack from literal demons and monsters. Feeling like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders while simultaneously always being underestimated by those around you is something that most teen girls could relate to, even if they didn't live on a literal hellmouth. And of course, many of those creepy creatures Buffy had to fend off represented parents' fears of the new and plentiful dangers that might be coming for their own teens as the new millennium approached. The liminal space that teen girls occupy between childhood and adulthood is often explored in movies of the era too. Beetlejuice is a great example. Main character Lydia Dietz is constantly miserable and feels that no one quite understands her, which is fairly typical for a teenage girl. But then she discovers her ability to see and speak to dead people, meeting Adam and Barbara, who are also in a liminal place, between being alive and passing on to the afterlife.
You guys really are dead.
In this way, it makes perfect sense that the person to speak to the ghosts is a teenage girl, someone who feels like life isn't worth living.
I want to be dead too.
No. Being dead really doesn't make things any easier.
And who isn't understood or even really noticed by the people who are meant to care about her. In Roger Ebert's review of Heathers, he wrote that adulthood could be defined as the process of learning to be shocked by things that do not shock teenagers. That gap between what shocks grown-ups and doesn't shock teenage girls was fully realized in 80s and 90s TV and film as teenage girl characters became fuller and more satisfying portrayals. And as they did so, they started a trend where the true terrifying nature of teenage girlhood began to be exposed on screen. Keep an eye out for the next take, when we'll be looking at how the on-screen teen girl became even more real and scarier still in the 2000s and 2010s. That's the take. Click here to watch a video we think you'll love, or here to check out a whole playlist of awesome content. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And make sure to subscribe to our Patreon for exclusive new videos.